The late summer air hung thick with tension over Brussels on the evening of September 1st, 1944. The distant thunder of Allied artillery signaled the approaching liberation, each concussion a heartbeat of hope for a city that had endured 4 years under Nazi occupation. Inside the imposing stone walls of Saint-Gilles prison, over 1,500 souls, political prisoners, resistance fighters, and downed Allied airmen listened to that distant thunder with a mixture of desperate hope and gnawing fear. Among them was Jean Dumont, former schoolteacher who had been caught distributing resistance newspapers, his thin frame now skeletal after months of meager rations and interrogations. The SS guards moved with unusual urgency through the corridors that evening, their boots echoing against the stone in sharp staccato rhythms that betrayed their nervous energy. Orders had come directly from Berlin. All prisoners were to be transported immediately to Germany. No one was to remain for the Allied forces to liberate. It was a pattern repeated across Europe as Nazi forces retreated. Death trains carrying human cargo eastward, erasing evidence of atrocities by sending the witnesses to their deaths. The prisoners of Saint-Gilles didn't know that they were about to become unwitting participants in a drama that would reveal the true machinery of Nazi genocide, a ghost train that would expose the industrial scale of murder that had been hidden behind euphemisms and lies. In the pre-dawn darkness of September 2nd, Jean and his fellow prisoners were roused from fitful sleep by shouts and the harsh glare of flashlights. "Raus, raus, schnell!" The guards' commands echoed through the cell blocks as prisoners were herded into the courtyard. The cool night air carried the scent of diesel exhaust and the metallic tang of weapons as SS troops formed a corridor of steel and menace. Jean clutched the small bundle of belongings he was permitted, a worn photograph of his wife and daughter, threadbare blanket, a small notebook where he had meticulously recorded his experiences in a microscopic script to save space. His stomach twisted with hunger and fear as he shuffled forward with the others. The procession moved through the streets of Brussels in the grey half-light of early morning, a ghastly parade of the condemned. Local residents peered from behind curtains, their faces etched with horror and pity. Some dared to emerge, pressing against the German cordon, desperate to catch a glimpse of loved ones. A woman broke through momentarily, thrusting a loaf of bread toward the prisoners before being roughly shoved back. As the column approached the Brussels Midi railway station, the full scope of the operation became apparent. 32 cattle cars waited on the tracks, surrounded by heavily armed guards. The prisoners were being loaded like livestock, crammed so tightly that sitting was impossible. Jean found himself pressed against strangers who would soon become intimates in their shared suffering, their bodies forced into uncomfortable proximity by the sheer number of humanity stuffed into spaces designed for animals. Each breath became precious in the crushing density, the instinctive human need for personal space quickly overridden by the imperative to simply remain upright in the surging mass of bodies. What neither Jean nor his fellow prisoners could know was that their journey was part of a vast network of deportation trains that had been operating across Europe for years. The scale of this operation was staggering. Millions of Jews and other victims had been transported via the railway networks to extermination camps in the east. The Deutsche Reichsbahn, Germany's national railway, had become the conveyor belt of genocide, its efficient schedules and technical precision put to the service of mass murder. Railway officials had calculated the optimal capacity of each car, determined the most efficient routes, and even charged the Nazi SS for each passenger transported to their death. The railways that had once symbolized the progress of industrialization and connected communities across the continent had been perverted into the primary logistical support for genocide. But on this particular morning, as the sun rose over Brussels, something extraordinary was happening. Belgian railway workers, many of them members of the resistance, had been alerted to this final deportation attempt. They knew the Allies were close, perhaps only days away from liberating the city, and they were determined that this train would never reach its destination. The resistance network had been preparing for this moment, establishing communication channels between railway stations and positioning operatives at key points along the intended route. Their weapons were not guns but wrenches, signal controls, and the intimate knowledge of Belgium's rail system, and they were about to deploy these tools in a sophisticated campaign of sabotage that would prove more effective than any military operation. Inside the cattle car, the air quickly became unbearable. Over 80 people stood pressed together, the summer heat intensifying with each passing hour. Sweat ran in rivulets down faces and necks, soaking through shirts and creating a humid miasma of body odor and fear. A single bucket in the corner served as a toilet, overflowing within hours and adding its stench to the already fetid atmosphere. Through small gaps in the wooden slats, thin beams of sunlight cut through the darkness, illuminating particles of dust that swirled in the trapped air. These narrow apertures became precious. Prisoners took turns breathing the slightly fresher air they provided, each inhalation a momentary relief. Jean found himself standing next to Pierre, an elderly professor of literature who had been arrested for publishing anti-Nazi pamphlets. Despite his frail appearance, Pierre's eyes burned with a fierce intelligence. "They're taking us to the camps," he whispered. "The death factories in the east." Jean had heard rumors of these places, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Bergen-Belsen, but like many, he had struggled to believe the accounts of industrial-scale murder that escaped prisoners had described. "My cousin escaped from a transport last year," continued Pierre, his voice barely audible above the creaking of the train. "He said they have gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. They burn the bodies in giant furnaces, thousands each day." The professor's words hung in the stifling air, too monstrous to fully comprehend, yet impossible to dismiss from the mouth of this dignified scholar. Around them, other prisoners listened in silence, their expressions a mixture of grim recognition and stunned disbelief. A young woman nearby began to quietly weep, the tears cutting clean tracks down her dirt-streaked face. An older man, a doctor, judging by the fragments of conversation John had overheard earlier, shook his head slowly. "I treated Jews in my practice for 30 years, he murmured. "My colleagues in Poland wrote to me in '42 about mass graves outside Warsaw. I thought they were exaggerating to secure foreign visas. God help me, I thought they were exaggerating." Outside the train, an intricate dance of sabotage and delay was unfolding. Michel Petit, a railway official and resistance member, orchestrated a series of technical difficulties. Locomotives mysteriously broke down, engineers called in sick or disappeared entirely, and signals malfunctioned, sending the train onto wrong tracks or forcing it to stop for extended periods. Every delay was precious. Every minute gained a small victory against the Nazi deportation machine. The SS officers grew increasingly agitated, their threats against the railway workers escalating as the hours passed without significant progress. By late afternoon, the train had only managed to crawl a few kilometers from the station, repeatedly sidetracked by mechanical issues that the Belgian railway workers addressed with deliberate, painstaking slowness. As darkness fell, the train had reached only as far as Mechelen, barely 20 kilometers from Brussels. The engineer, claiming exhaustion, refused to continue through the night on unfamiliar tracks. The German officers, furious but helpless without qualified personnel to operate the locomotive, ordered the train to halt until morning. Inside the cattle cars, the prisoners huddled against the night chill that replaced the day's suffocating heat, their bodies pressed together now for warmth rather than by constraint. Small acts of humanity bloomed in this darkness. Strangers shared meager food rations, supported those who were weakening, and whispered words of courage and hope. John offered half his water to a young resistance fighter, whose feverish skin betrayed the infection spreading from an interrogation wound. The boy couldn't have been older than 17, with the wispy beginnings of a mustache that would never fully mature. His eyes, bright with fever, locked onto Jean's with fierce gratitude. "My father was a railway man," he whispered, "before they arrested him last year. He would be proud of his colleagues today." The boy managed a ghost of a smile before drifting into fitful sleep, his head resting against John's shoulder. The dawn of September 3rd brought new hope and new complications for the German officers. Reports reached them that Allied forces were advancing rapidly toward Brussels. British tanks might reach the city by nightfall. The decision was made to return the train to Brussels, where the prisoners could be transferred to trucks or alternate routes eastward. But as the train reversed course, the sabotage continued. The locomotive moved at a crawl, supposedly to prevent derailment on damaged tracks. Meanwhile, Swiss and Swedish diplomats working with the International Red Cross had learned of the transport and were negotiating frantically with German officials for the release of the prisoners. The Nazi command structure was beginning to fragment under the pressure of imminent defeat, creating openings for these humanitarian interventions. By noon, as the train limped back toward Brussels, word reached the German ambassador that SS headquarters had agreed to release the political prisoners. The diplomatic delegation rushed to the Klein Eiland station where the train had stopped, carrying the official orders for the prisoners' release. In a moment of extraordinary bureaucratic confusion that would save hundreds of lives, the German railway commander, who had not received direct orders from the SS, agreed to open the cattle cars. The Swiss diplomat, who secured this final authorization, would later describe it as a miracle of paperwork, a perfect German respect for official documents, overriding the murderous logic of the final solution in its dying days. The railway commander, a career bureaucrat rather than an ideological Nazi, found himself caught between conflicting authorities and chose the path that required the least personal initiative, compliance with the formally presented diplomatic request. His choice, motivated perhaps more by self-preservation than compassion as Allied forces approached, would nonetheless save over 1,000 lives. The scene that unfolded as the heavy wooden doors slid open revealed the true face of Nazi deportation, the humanitarian catastrophe that millions of Jews and others had endured before reaching the death camps. Prisoners stumbled out into the sunlight, blinking and disoriented after nearly 2 days in darkness. Many collapsed on the platform, too weak to stand after hours without water in the summer heat. The diplomats and Red Cross workers who witnessed their emergence were shocked by their condition after just this brief journey. Hollow-eyed, dehydrated, some delirious from the ordeal, Jean helped Pierre, the elderly professor, whose legs had given out during the night. As they emerged into the light, Jean was struck by the realization that this journey of less than 40 kilometers had nearly killed some of the weaker prisoners. "My God," whispered a Swiss diplomat who helped Jean lower Pierre onto a stretcher. "If this is what happens on a train that never left Belgium, what becomes of those who travel for days to the camps in Poland?" It was a question that pierced through propaganda and exposed the lethal reality of Nazi deportations. These trains were not merely transportation, they were mobile chambers of death, where the process of killing began long before arrival at the camps. The diplomat, a middle-aged man with silver-rimmed glasses, who had spent the war in the careful neutrality of official correspondence and negotiation, suddenly found himself confronted with the physical reality of Nazi persecution. His hands trembled as he helped distribute water to the released prisoners, his diplomatic reserve cracking at the edges as he witnessed human suffering that no diplomatic note could fully capture. "We knew," he muttered, almost to himself. "We knew, but we didn't know like this." For the Jewish deportees who had been transported eastward over the previous 3 years, the journey itself was often a death sentence. Locked in cattle cars for days with no food, water, or sanitation facilities, many died before reaching the camps. In summer, the heat inside the sealed wagons could rise to lethal levels. In winter, passengers froze to death. A Polish railway worker had once described seeing liquid seeping from a stationary death train in the height of summer, the fluids of decomposing bodies that had been trapped inside for over a week. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, their smaller or weaker bodies succumbing quickly to dehydration and exposure. The Nazi bureaucrats who designed this system knew this. Mortality during transport was calculated and accepted as part of the process. The railways that had once connected Europe's great cities had become conveyor belts of death, their schedules and routes now organized around the efficient delivery of humans to slaughter. A Wehrmacht officer who had witnessed a deportation from Amsterdam later testified that the railway officials had estimated a 15% mortality rate during the 3-day journey to Auschwitz, factoring this into their capacity calculations as if planning for normal cargo spoilage. This cold arithmetic of mass death represented a new kind of evil, not the passionate hatred of the pogrom, but the dispassionate efficiency of modern bureaucratic murder. The deportation trains were the physical embodiment of this system, moving along the same tracks that carried mail, manufactured goods and holiday travelers, but delivering their human cargo to an industrialized killing process unprecedented in human history. As Jean stumbled away from the train, supported by Red Cross workers, he saw Brussels citizens rushing toward the station. Word had spread that a prison train had returned, and families desperate for information about missing loved ones converged on Klein Island. Reunion scenes played out amid tears and embraces, but there were also cries of despair from those who did not find the faces they sought. Jean learned later that many other trains had departed Belgium before this one. Over 25,000 Jews had been deported from the Dossern barracks in Mechelen to Auschwitz between 1942 and 1944. Of these, fewer than 1,500 would return after the war. Most had perished in the gas chambers within hours of their arrival, victims of an extermination process that had been refined to industrial efficiency. The failed ghost train of September 1944 had provided a rare window into this machinery of death, a system that would have remained largely invisible to the Western Allies had it operated as designed, with its victims and witnesses disappearing into the void of the camps. The Belgian resistance fighters who had sabotaged the train hadn't just saved lives, they had preserved evidence of how the Holocaust operated, evidence that would later prove crucial in understanding the full scope of Nazi crimes. A middle-aged woman approached Jean, clutching a photograph of a young man. "My son," she explained, her voice tight with controlled emotion, "arrested in June for helping downed British pilots." Jean shook his head sadly. He had not seen the young man among the prisoners. The woman nodded, unsurprised but still devastated. "They took him east in July," she said. "We received one postcard from a place called Mauthausen. Nothing since." She folded the photograph carefully and returned it to her purse. "At least you have returned. That gives me hope." Jean couldn't bear to tell her what Pierre had described about the camps. He simply squeezed her hand, unable to offer the comfort of false hope, but unwilling to extinguish what little flame remained. The afternoon brought the thunder of approaching tanks. Not German, but British. The Welsh guards entered Brussels to jubilant crowds, flowers thrown beneath their treads, champagne passed up to soldiers who had fought their way from Normandy. The liberation that the prisoners had feared would come too late had arrived just in time, transforming their death train into a ghost, a spectre that had failed to complete its grim journey. The 53 Allied airmen who had been aboard the train, and who remarkably had not been released with the political prisoners, managed to escape in the confusion and melted into the celebrating crowds. Jan, after receiving medical attention, made his way to his sister's apartment in the city center. From her balcony, he watched the liberation unfold, the joyous scenes below a stark contrast to the horrors he had narrowly escaped. That evening, as Brussels celebrated its first night of freedom, Jean began to write. His schoolteacher's discipline asserted itself as he methodically recorded every detail of the transport, the conditions in the cattle cars, the conversations overheard between guards, the systematic process by which humans were reduced to freight. "The world must know," he wrote, "not just that these atrocities happened, but how they happened. The rails and timetables and cattle cars that made mass murder possible." The pen moved steadily across the paper despite his exhaustion, filling page after page with testimony that would later prove invaluable to investigators. His sister watched him from the doorway, concerned by his intensity, but understanding his need to document what he had experienced. The sounds of celebration drifted up from the streets below. Spontaneous dancing, music, the popping of champagne corks, the laughter of a city reborn. But Jean remained at his desk, writing by lamplight, his mind still on the train and on the thousands of others like it that had completed their journeys to the east. He felt a responsibility to those who would never return, to ensure that the method of their disappearance would not itself vanish into history. In the following months, as Allied forces pushed eastward into Germany, they would discover the full horror of the Nazi concentration camp system. The emaciated survivors and mountains of corpses at Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen and Dachau shocked the conscience of humanity. But what was less immediately visible was the vast infrastructure that had enabled these atrocities, the network of railways that had transported millions to their deaths with cold efficiency. The ghost train of Brussels offered a rare insight into this system while it was still operational, revealing the role of supposedly civilian infrastructure in genocide. After the war, investigations would show that the Deutsche Reichsbahn had transported over 3 million Jews to extermination camps between 1941 and 1944. The railway had charged the equivalent of a third-class passenger ticket for each deportee, with children under 10 traveling at half price. Special group rates were applied for transports of over 400 people. The clinical bureaucracy of these arrangements, the schedules, invoices, and rate calculations revealed the true banality of evil, genocide executed through the ordinary mechanisms of modern administration and infrastructure. When Allied investigators examined captured railway archives, they found meticulously maintained ledgers tracking the special transports with the same administrative precision applied to shipments of coal or manufactured goods. The records showed careful coordination between the Reichsbahn, the SS, and civilian authorities across occupied Europe, a vast logistical operation that required the complicity of thousands of functionaries who never directly killed anyone, but whose paperwork, schedules, and technical expertise made mass murder possible. Most disturbing were the communications regarding the efficiency of the transports, bureaucratic discussions about how to maximize capacity by removing seats and water facilities from the cattle cars, calculations of how many people could physically fit in each wagon, and cold assessments of anticipated mortality rates during longer journeys. Jean Dumont survived the war and testified at the Nuremberg trials, where the full scope of Nazi atrocities was laid bare for international judgment. His detailed account of the Brussels ghost train provided prosecutors with valuable evidence about the deportation system. When shown railway timetables documenting the movement of special trains from various European cities to Auschwitz and other camps, Jean identified the familiar administrative language that had masked mass murder. These were not special trains, he told the court. They were death transports designed to break the body and spirit before the camps finished the job. His testimony helped establish that the Holocaust was not merely the work of SS executioners at the camps, but a vast logistical operation involving countless functionaries, bureaucrats, and technical experts who had placed their professional skills in service to genocide. The railways, symbols of European modernity and progress, had become essential tools of mass murder, their efficiency repurposed for history's greatest crime. Jean found the courtroom experience surreal. Precise legal procedures, the somber decorum, the careful translation of testimony into multiple languages, all attempting to process crimes that defied conventional understanding of human behavior. The defendants sat in the dock, ordinary men in suits rather than the demons their actions suggested they should be. One railway administrator, called to testify about his role in scheduling deportation trains, insisted he had merely been solving complex logistical problems without knowledge of their purpose, a claim belied by the documents bearing his signature that specified the transport conditions designed to maximize suffering. When cross-examined about why cattle cars were used instead of passenger cars, the administrator cited efficiency concerns before falling silent under the weight of the court's collective disgust. During one particularly difficult day of testimony, Jean described the conditions inside the cattle car: the overcrowding, the lack of water, the bucket overflowing with excrement. The defense attorney interrupted, suggesting that such conditions were regrettable consequences of wartime transportation shortages rather than deliberate cruelty. Jean's response silenced the courtroom. When we stopped at Mechlin station overnight, I could see through a crack in the wooden slats. On the adjacent track was a passenger train being prepared for German officers on leave. Clean carriages with upholstered seats, dining cars with white tablecloths. There was no shortage of passenger capacity, only a shortage of humanity. This observation cut through the bureaucratic excuses and exposed the deliberate nature of the transport conditions, not necessities of war, but calculated components of the killing process. The defense attorney did not pursue this line of questioning further. The American prosecutor later told Jean that his testimony about the parallel trains, one designed for comfort, one designed for suffering, had provided one of the most damning images of the trial, crystallizing for the judges the systematic nature of Nazi dehumanization. It was a single image that captured the essence of the Holocaust, not just the mass killings, but the calculated stripping away of human dignity that preceded physical destruction. The juxtaposition of the cattle cars and passenger trains demonstrated that the inhumane conditions were not an unfortunate byproduct of wartime necessity, but a deliberate policy. The first stage in a process designed to transform human beings into objects for disposal. Decades later, Jean returned to Brussels for the dedication of a memorial at Klein Eiland Station. Now an elderly man with grandchildren, he stood with other survivors as a plaque was unveiled, commemorating the ghost train and the resistance members who had prevented it from reaching its destination. A group of school children listened attentively as Jean described the conditions inside the cattle cars, their young faces registering shock at cruelties that seemed impossible in the peaceful Europe they had known. One girl raised her hand and asked a question that pierced Jean to his core. Why did no one stop the trains before? It was the question that had haunted Europe's conscience since the war. How a continent of educated, cultured people had allowed millions to be transported to their deaths along the same rail lines that carried holiday travelers and commuters. Jean had no simple answer, only the complicated truth about fear, complicity, and the compartmentalization that allows ordinary people to participate in extraordinary evil. The trains themselves became instruments of deception, he told her. They made genocide seem like transportation, a logistical problem rather than mass murder. By the time most people understood what was happening, it was too late. The girl nodded, not fully satisfied, but beginning to grasp the terrible lesson of the Holocaust, that evil often wears the face of everyday life, hiding its true nature behind familiar structures and routines. An elderly railway worker who had participated in the sabotage operation joined Jean at the podium, his hands gnarled with age, but still bearing the strength that had once loosened critical bolts and rerouted trains. "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes," he told the children. "We were just doing what we could, where we were with what we had. Remember that when you see something wrong in the world, you don't need to be special to resist. You just need to be willing." After the ceremony, Jean walked alone along the platforms where the ghost train had stood. The station had been rebuilt and modernized over the decades, but he could still see the shadows of that September morning. The cattle cars with their human cargo, the desperate faces peering through cracks in the wooden slats, the SS guards with their machine guns and their casual brutality. He thought of the millions who had made similar journeys but never returned, whose stories remained untold because there were no survivors to tell them. The railways that had once symbolized progress and connection had been perverted into instruments of mass murder and then reclaimed for their original purpose after the war. Passenger trains now departed from these same platforms, carrying tourists, business people, and families on their peaceful journeys. Few of these travelers would know or think about the death trains that had once used these same tracks, or the narrow window of insight provided by the ghost train that failed to complete its journey. Jean found himself wondering what had happened to that young Swiss diplomat, whose hands had trembled as he helped distribute water to the released prisoners. Had he carried that memory back to his comfortable neutrality? Had it changed how he viewed the world and his place in it? There were so many witnesses to fragments of the Holocaust: railway workers, diplomats, local residents who had watched the deportations, each holding a piece of the terrible puzzle, but few seeing the complete picture until it was too late. Jean paused at the exact spot where the cattle car containing him had stopped. He closed his eyes and could still smell the stench, hear the labored breathing of too many people in too small a space, feel the press of bodies against his own. The memory remained vivid, despite the decades that had passed, a wound that time had scarred over, but never fully healed. He wondered how many other places across Europe held similar invisible markers of suffering. Ordinary train platforms and sidings where extraordinary cruelties had unfolded, now covered over by the veneer of ordinary life resuming its course. The Brussels ghost train stands as both exception and exemplar in the history of the Holocaust. Exceptional because it failed in its mission, exemplary because it revealed the mechanisms by which millions were delivered to death. The cattle cars that returned to Brussels in September 1944 offered the Western Allies a glimpse of the deportation system while it was still operational, providing crucial evidence about how the final solution had been implemented across Europe. The narrow escape of those 1,500 prisoners illuminated the fate of millions who had no such reprieve. Jews from Amsterdam, Paris, Thessaloniki, Budapest, and countless other communities who had made the one-way journey to the east. Their ghosts travel those rail lines still, a permanent indictment of technology and expertise, divorced from moral consideration. The ghost train reminds us that genocide was not executed solely through guns and gas chambers, but through the mundane infrastructure of modern life, railways, bureaucracies, and technical expertise that were turned toward murder with terrifying ease. It stands as warning about how quickly the machinery of civilization can become the machinery of death when guided by ideologies of hatred. The ghost train reveals the most disturbing aspect of the Holocaust. Not just that humans could conceive such horror, but that they could implement it through the same systems and structures that define modern society. The trains that carried families on vacation one day could transport them to extinction the next. The bureaucrats who processed routine paperwork could adjust their forms to process mass murder with equal efficiency. The engineers who designed comfortable passenger carriages could apply their expertise to calculating maximum capacity for deportation cars. The Holocaust did not require the suspension of modern systems, but their continuation in the service of genocide. And this is perhaps its most enduring warning. As you walk the peaceful railway platforms of modern Europe, pause sometimes to remember those other journeys. The ghost trains that once traversed these same tracks, carrying human cargo to destruction. Listen for the echoes of those cattle cars in the quiet moments between departures and arrivals. The Holocaust happened not in some distant primitive realm, but in the heart of modern Europe, using the same railways that had been symbols of progress and connection. The tracks remain, now carrying passengers to business meetings and family gatherings rather than to extinction, but they bear the invisible weight of that history. The story of the Brussels ghost train is not merely about a narrow escape, but about confronting how ordinary systems can become extraordinary instruments of evil. It challenges us to examine the infrastructures of our own world, the technologies, bureaucracies, and networks that shape modern life, and to remain vigilant about how they might be deployed. For the true face of the Holocaust was not found solely in the gas chambers and crematoria, but in the mundane systems that delivered millions to their deaths with cold, mechanical precision. The railways of Europe were the arteries of genocide, pumping human beings toward annihilation with timetabled regularity. This is what the ghost train revealed, not just the brutality of the Nazi regime, but how modern systems could make industrial-scale murder possible. Remember this when you hear the whistle of a train in the distance. Remember the ghost trains. Remember and remain vigilant.